Welcome to the Dear NICU Mama podcast. This podcast is a safe place to connect with other NICU moms by listening to interviews with trauma-informed medical and maternal mental health experts, remarkable stories from the NICU, and intentional roundtable conversations.
Our hope is that you feel like you're sitting across the table from another NICU sister and feel seen and validated in your experience. No matter where you are on your healing journey, this podcast is here to remind you that you are not alone. Welcome to the sisterhood.
Happy Wednesday, beautiful mamas, and happy Mother's Day. We hope you guys had the most magical weekend. And if you didn't have a chance to listen to the last episode, we talked all about honoring the grief and joy that comes around holidays like Mother's Day. And so we hope that it was very gentle and kind to your heart and that you were able to do what you needed to do to celebrate and just honor your remarkable motherhood story. So welcome back to the podcast. Aisha, we have a very special guest today.
We do. I'm very excited for today's episode. I think it's going to be so good for our sisterhood to hear our guest today speak. So, you know our guest because you were on her podcast a while back. And so would you like to introduce our special guest?
I would love to. I first want to preface that it's so fun to do these because I feel like it takes social media, like it makes social media feel real a little bit because we've had the opportunity to connect with Kayleigh often on social media and we love all of the content that she creates and just the work that she does. And so when we got to do the podcast with you last fall, it was really fun because it was like, oh my gosh, we're having a real like face-to-face conversation. And so it feels very similarly today. So if you are a mama who has experienced birth trauma, there's a very significant chance you have heard of the birth trauma mama, and that is who we have on the podcast today. So Kayleigh, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me and such a warm introduction. I'm so excited to be here. Like you said, I say this all the time. I swear I run a podcast just so that I get to have these conversations and actually talk to people, face to face virtually. Because if not, I would never have these friendships and relationships, which is so cool.
Right? Yeah. I know. Sometimes it's wild to think that like we haven't actually met in person, but it feels like we have.
So. It's wild. It's wild. It's so cool.
I love it. Well, we are so honored to have you here. On the podcast, we have the chance to talk with moms about their stories. We talk with a wide variety of specialists, and you are one of those specialists that really talks beautifully about the topic of birth trauma. And I think what's so unique, and we touched on this a little bit when we were on yours, is that you're so vulnerable with the work that you do because your work is really centered around your personal experience as a mom and having a traumatic birth. And so can we start a little bit at the beginning and just hear about who you are and what you do?
Absolutely. Yeah. So my name is Kayleigh Summers. I'm a licensed clinical social worker, so licensed therapist, and I specialize in perinatal trauma. So I own a practice that specializes specifically in supporting families who have experienced any sort of trauma within that perinatal period. And I kind of fell into that work, as most of us do. Through my own experience of birth trauma during the birth of my son. So I was already a therapist before I had my son, and then I ended up obviously shifting into the perinatal mental health and then specifically the perinatal trauma space after having an amniotic fluid embolism with my son.
Wow. I love when you highlighted like when we fall into these things because I think that's so true. And so you said a couple things that I was already like, I don't know what that means. So would you be able to maybe, for me, like perinatal, I know like, is that anything surrounding pregnancy or?
Yeah, perinatal is pregnancy, it's birth, it's postpartum, it's anything to do with that perinatal period. Sometimes we say reproductive and perinatal trauma because we also include that trying to conceive community. And there's significant trauma for many different reasons that shows up in that community as well. And that is definitely a community that I see in my practice.
No. Is there anything special that you have to do to start that? Because you were already a therapist. What did you have to do to kind of like shift that focus?
Yeah, a lot of training. Just ethically, in my opinion, you need to be trained to work with these populations. A lived experience is not enough.
Yes.
And while I value that, and I think that is a very important part of the work that I do, it is not enough in and of itself, and also comes with its own concerns. We have to do a lot of our own work before we are ready to sit with clients in their experiences and their stories to make sure that we are well prepared for that. We know our own stuff, our triggers, and how we can navigate through that while also being a really good ethical therapist. So I had lots of perinatal mental health training through PSI early on, and Postpartum Support International. And I also have specific training in some trauma modalities. So I'm trained in EMDR therapy, as well as I am in the beginning stages of being trained in IFS. So I like to say I'm an IFS-informed therapist, which is internal family systems.
You are a lady boss doing all of it. That's remarkable. Well, one thing that many of us in the NICU community experience is when you envision your birth story, you envision what you've seen portrayed in all of the movies, in all of the Huggies commercials, and even what your closest friends and family have experienced. And when your birth does not go according to plan, and there is this label of trauma on top of it, there's a lot of grief that comes along with that. And so I'd love to know from you how you define a traumatic birth and how you kind of walk with your clients, or even in your own personal journey, of that level of acceptance of, my birth didn't go as planned. I now have this label of having a traumatic birth. What are some of those first initial signs, and how do you define that?
Yeah, so I'll start with defining birth trauma. I think for me, it's a very simple definition of anything that overwhelms the nervous system's ability to cope. That is related to birth. So a distressing event that overwhelms the nervous system's ability to cope in the birth environment. Or again, if we're talking the perinatal period, pregnancy, birth, or postpartum. And what that means is it's a very subjective experience. So something that is traumatic for one person may not be traumatic for another person, and vice versa. And so I know there's a lot of rhetoric out there that's like, oh, we're calling everything trauma. Like, not everything is traumatic. And like, I hear that. I understand the frustration with that. And I also truly believe it's just not our job to label what is traumatic for someone else. And the way that their nervous system perceives a threat in their environment is not their choice. That is an automatic response of their nervous system. So people are not choosing to be traumatized. It is just happening to them. No one would choose this. And it happens based on a lot of different factors. And that's why birth trauma is so wide-ranging in the way that it occurs and the causes that sort of preempt it.
Absolutely. That's such a beautiful definition, and I love that you've kept it really simple in how you define that, because I think what that does is it gives moms a lot of permission to let go of that shame of, I shouldn't feel that was traumatic because it wasn't for so-and-so, or it wasn't as traumatic as so-and-so's birth or experience. And so that definition alone releases a lot of shame around the idea of, I shouldn't react this way, or I shouldn't feel this way.
There's a lot of comparison that happens in the birth trauma community of, it could have been worse, or so-and-so down the street had a much worse birth than me. I don't have any room to feel this way. And I use a metaphor for this, which is, trauma is basically your house on fire. And if your house is on fire, the first thing you do is not open your door to look outside to see whose house is on fire worse than yours. You take care of your fire.
Wow.
You call someone for help. You take care of it yourself, whatever it is, but you take care of your own fire. And you deserve to take care of your own fire so that your house doesn't burn down while you're watching other people's houses burn down worse than yours.
That's beautiful.
That is so beautiful, and like Ashley said, I do think that it's going to be incredibly validating to so many who are listening to this episode. And so I wanted to piggyback off of that, and so once you've defined it, once you know, okay, I have this traumatic experience that is surrounding my birth, what then? right?
Yeah. So there are a lot of things. So first of all, often recognizing that you've experienced trauma is helpful and validating, but there are some people who don't want that label, and that's okay. Like I want to validate that too. Like I'm never going to call someone else's birth traumatic for them if they're not interested in that. But sometimes it can be really healing to be like, oh, I hear a lot like, oh, I realized that this was trauma. Like I'm just going about my life wondering why I feel this way and feel so awful. And I like explained my birth trauma to someone, or I explained my birth story to someone, and they're like, wow, that was a lot. And that's when I realized, oh, maybe I'm experiencing trauma. And so it ends up being really validating. But, it's not our kind of, like I said earlier, decision to make for others. But if someone is recognizing like that experience, like, oh, geez, I think maybe this might be trauma. Now what do I do? And we recognize that there's a few different layers of support that most birth trauma survivors find really helpful. And these are just kind of general layers, but the community support, so spaces like yours, pretty much, I won't say all, but there are very, very, very many Facebook support groups for like specific complication-based experiences of trauma. So you can always kind of search those, and that community can be really helpful for you. And then just finding community anywhere in social media spaces. So connecting with others who have experienced obstetric violence, connecting with others, again, who have NICU journeys, anything that makes you feel like, oh, I'm not the only one. Because the key to birth trauma is it's so incredibly isolating. Yeah. And you feel so lonely. So being able to make that connection is definitely a huge step. And then I'm always going to recommend therapy. And that's going to look different for everyone, meaning like the timing. I don't know how you both feel about this being in the NICU community, but working with a lot of NICU parents, I find that there's this like sentiment of like, but you've got to take care of yourself first. And I'm like, I hear that, but also it's actually impossible. And there are times where we can't do that. And that has to just kind of be okay. Like, listen, I want everyone to take care of themselves. Everyone who's listening, please, you deserve to be taken care of. You deserve to take care of yourselves. But I think we also have to honor that when your baby is in the NICU, it is all about them in those moments. Yes. And there's fallout from that. And we will deal with that fallout when you are finally home and can catch your breath.
Yes.
For those who get to bring their baby home, right?
For sure.
And so my point being, everyone accessing therapy will happen at different times, and there's no like right or wrong time to access therapy. I have people who are 2 weeks out, and I have people who are like 20 years out, and their birth trauma is still impacting them, and they want therapy.
Absolutely.
For that.
No, that's so good. And I think we talk a lot about like acceptance and how sometimes it takes time to fully be able to like accept that maybe the birth was traumatic, or that really happened to me, or, and we have a lot of moms that, you talked about the Facebook groups, will join the Facebook group and won't like actually engage for maybe like a year. They'll just kind of be like a silent observer because they aren't at a place yet to like fully be like, yep, this is also my story. And that's okay. I think it's also like you talked about, like, it's okay if it takes time for you to be willing to, really like accept. And I think too that the hard thing about anything that has the word trauma related to it, right, is it feels like there's this red lettering on our story now. And it's like, no longer is it just like my birth story, but it's my traumatic birth story. No longer is it my motherhood journey. It's my NICU motherhood journey, and there's always like these red letters. And so I would love to know from you how you work with moms and families to really see that letter as not like this like caution tape on, a type of definition, but how you work with families to see that as like a beautiful and, significant part of their story.
Yeah, it's a great question. I feel really strongly about this topic because I think that it is so painful to sit with trauma as a part of your birth story. It is like white hot painful to sit with that as your truth. And so I find that there is a rush to make it feel better, to make it feel accepted, to integrate it as this hopeful, like, post-traumatic, like, where's my post-traumatic growth I hear everyone talk about? Like, when can I get to that? And so much of the healing happens in the process. And like you said, it takes time. And so we have to sit with the grief. We have to grieve the experience that we didn't get to have before we can start like integrating it into our accepted story. And I hear from a lot of parents, like, I let's do that. How do we do that? What are the tools to do that? And it's related to time. I'm not a time heals all wounds because it doesn't, but time and treatment. So integrating the trauma. So here's an important piece. We can treat trauma. So when I say that, when people are experiencing symptoms of trauma, so typically we see two different symptomologies related to trauma. A hyperarousal, so that's that like hypervigilant, like very buzzy is how I like to say it. And then the hypoarousal, which is more numbed out, disconnected. And you can actually jump between the two as well. So when we're seeing those experiences of trauma, we can treat that trauma, the re-experiencing, the getting triggered by like NICU smells or NICU sounds. We can treat that through integrating the traumatic memory. But this grief, this loss is often we will get kind of through some trauma treatment and the experience will feel less overwhelming. It will feel less charged, as we like to say. But then we get like punched in the face with grief. Because the acute trauma stage, we've kind of navigated our way out of, but now it's all of this loss around the things that we didn't get to have with our birth experience. And so grieving is a process, though, like a lifelong process. And it takes time. And I think the best way for me to describe this is the more that you sit with the grief that you've experienced, the more capacity you make to find the joy next to that grief. And you know, it quite literally looks like scrolling your feed and seeing a beautiful birth and feeling jealous and angry and sad. And one option is, I can't feel that way. That's not acceptable. And the other option is, yeah, wow, this really hurts and I'm going to stay with this for a minute because I have the time right now and I'm just going to let it out in whatever way that looks. If it's crying, if it's writing, but truly sitting with these feelings is then how we are able to grow our capacity to feel joy and gratitude next to them.
Yeah.
That's so beautiful. I feel like one of the things that when I started therapy, I lost my first baby and then very quickly got pregnant with my daughter and had a NICU stay. And we were home and I was just like crying all day. Like I just was not, I knew I was not okay because I couldn't feel joy, even though I was grateful that I was home. I was going through a lot. I was processing finally a lot of the things that we had been through, even back to when we had lost our son. And so I started going to therapy. And I remember that my husband would always ask me, why are you doing this? Because I feel like you're getting worse. I feel like you're crying more or you're more sad. And you're just like, is this helping you? Or are you just kind of like picking at a wound and not really getting better? Because I honestly feel like you're getting worse. And I was like, I think I'm just finally allowing myself to feel everything that I didn't allow myself to feel for a very long time. Like in the span of 3 years, like everything I didn't feel, I'm finally feeling. And it's like that saying, like it has to kind of get worse before it starts getting better because, I love that the capacity is actually, as you feel it, then you have more room because you're not holding on to something anymore that's taking up all the space. You're actually releasing. So that I think that that's so important too, because if you are going to therapy and you're like, I'm not getting better, I'm just feeling worse, or I'm feeling more pain, I think it is just that allowing yourself to admit, like, I am feeling all of this. These are real feelings and emotions, and it's a lot.
Yeah. And my only caveat that I have to say as a trauma therapist is that if you feel like you're getting better because all you're doing is talking about and reliving your traumatic experience in therapy, that is a problem. And we want to make sure that people are just, if people are listening to this, I want them to take this away. Like, yes, we are sitting with the grief, and it often does feel like people will leave therapy and not always feel better in those moments, because we are. But when it comes to talk therapy for trauma, in my opinion, this is my opinion as a therapist, can be not helpful and at times harmful if we are just kind of sitting and re-experiencing and reliving it without helping move towards integration through, again, either like brain spotting, EMDR, IFS, somatic experiencing, any of the kind of bottom up approaches.
Yes.
Just want to put that caveat in, because I don't want people like languishing in talk therapy and re-traumatizing themselves and feeling that does not sound like your experience at all. But I just want to put that little plug in there.
No, very important. Yes, absolutely. I think that's why we have people like you.
Well, I follow this. She's in like the Christian community, but she teaches a lot of people that maybe in the Christian community have labeled like, well, just pray more, or God doesn't give you more than you can handle, right? Some of those statements. And she recently lost someone really close to her. And she did this whole post that I thought was so timely. And I thought a lot of moms in our community was, please don't pray my grief away. It's actually necessary that I grieve. And so she was teaching people like, please don't ask that God would take my grief, or please don't pray it away from me. She's like, it's actually a necessary part of how I will ever be able to heal and move forward. And I think what you're providing too is teaching people how to support somebody who's grieving, because we just expect that, well, you had a hard time, you came home, and now it's the happy part, right? And I think too, reminding moms that, because I've had to remind myself of that my state of grief does not determine my level of gratitude. And that just because I'm grieving does not make me any less grateful for my story or my son, or, those things can go hand in hand. Some days I might just feel one more than the other. And so I think what you say too just gives moms permission that grief is a necessary part of healing, and that the duality of grief and joy and grief and gratitude can coexist oftentimes in the very same second.
Yeah. I mean, as humans, we very, very rarely are ever having one emotion at a time.
Absolutely.
The practice of gratitude has gotten a lot of, I don't know, attention, right?
Yeah, just a little bit.
Practice gratitude. And listen, it has a place. We have research on it. Love.
Yeah.
Traumatized brain cannot access gratitude as easily.
Yep.
And forced gratitude does not feel good.
Yeah.
Like and I think what people don't realize too is when they begin to heal more, when they begin to sit with the grief, when they begin to heal some of their trauma, the gratitude comes naturally.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of gratitude that we are hoping for and looking for. And the kind of gratitude that's like that post-traumatic growth.
Yeah, absolutely. Such a good key point. Yeah. Well, and just to go quote backwards a little bit, because we haven't had a chance to really touch on your personal story. And so if we take the specialist hat off for a second and put on the mom hat for a second, we'd love to know a little bit about your story, and just to encourage moms that, because I think, again, we envision like the golden hour pictures. And when we see pictures of ourselves and we're, under anesthesia, we're conked out full of wires and tubes. And I recently posted over Mother's Day just a little segment about my husband of like, I'm so thankful he tells me my birth story, because I don't know a lot of it. Like, I don't personally know a lot of it. I was out. So he tells me my birth story more than like what I know, because I just wasn't there. And so we would love to know just more of your story and, what ignites this passion for the work that you do.
Of course, I will give the very short version
Yeah.
of my story. So I was it was my first child, super healthy pregnancy. And I went in, I did at the end have some high blood pressure, gestational hypertension. And I was really worried about how big my baby was. And no one else was. But I was like, I feel like he's huge. And they were like, yeah, you've never felt a baby inside of you. They're all big, blah, blah, blah. So with like both of those things, I made an informed decision with my team to move forward with an induction when I was after 40 weeks. And the induction was like one of those long, slow processes, like 2 full days. But I was finally 10 centimeters. And when I had gotten to 10 centimeters, my nurse and my husband were in the room. And I turned to my nurse and I was like, I am not feeling well. She was like, that's super normal for transition. Let me get you a bag to be sick in. And then I said, like, nope, something is very wrong. And then I started screaming that something was wrong with my heart. And I immediately went into cardiopulmonary arrest. So my heart stopped and I stopped breathing. A code blue was called for my room at that point. Lots of people came rushing in. CPR was started. I was taken to the OR. My son was thankfully delivered within 6 minutes of the code call, which 1000% saved his life. And so he was 11 pounds. He was 10-14. So
Wow.
he was big, and I win that game.
Yes, you do.
Yes. I know there are bigger babies, don't worry, but I am like
Very large.
5'6".
Yeah.
I'm like a normal person. My husband's only 5'9". Like we're not big people, but we tend to grow big babies on my side of the family. My brother was also 11 pounds.
Oh my goodness.
So he was good. I was not. So my doctor realized I was having an amniotic fluid embolism at that point, and did all of the things that needed to be done for DIC. I ended up needing 143 units of blood product. I think the pregnant body holds about like 10. So I lost my full blood volume many, many times. And I really struggled to recover. I had another cardiac arrest and they really couldn't get me back. So they called another hospital for ECMO, which is the highest form of life support. I know a lot of NICU parents know about ECMO from its use on babies. And so I was on VA ECMO for both heart and lung support. And I did require a hysterectomy due to the blood loss. And my right ovary was also removed in that process. And it was, a kind of 12-hour initial ordeal to get me stabilized on ECMO and transferred. And then I had a lot of heart issues that they couldn't quite get my heart to recover in the way that it needed to. So they needed to use something called an Impella, which basically goes up in through your femoral artery into your heart, and offloads it to give it time to rest and hopefully recover so that I would survive. And that is thankfully what happened. And I had about 4 more abdominal surgeries. And I was able to come off of ECMO and Impella and wake up. I was taken out of sedation and extubated about 4 or 5 days after my amniotic fluid embolism. And then I met my son on day 6, but I don't unfortunately remember any of that. But they have lots of videos and pictures of that, which I'm so appreciative of. And it's one of the things I'm always preaching. Pictures, videos can always be deleted after the fact. Someone doesn't want them, but they can't be magically retaken if they were not taken. And these moments that are missed by us are so important, and we are always wanting more. I have an album of thousands, like over 1,000 pictures and videos. And I'm like, why wasn't there a picture of that really specific thing? Or why did you guys not take a video of that? Like, where's like the video of me getting extubated? Why would they take a video of that? So an amniotic fluid embolism is super rare. It's super deadly. It has a very high mortality rate. And so that's the story that I was told. And so the story that I told myself was that, like, I couldn't be anything but grateful because there are people dying of this. And somehow, even my doctors were like, we don't actually know how you survived this. And I'm like, you guys. And they're like, kind of, but also some luck.
Wow.
And so, so I very much was like, oh my God, I get to go home. This is going to be a fairy tale. I get a second chance at life. I get to be a mom. And all of those things were very true.
Mm-hmm.
But I got home and quickly learned that this was going to be the most difficult experience of my life.
Mm-hmm.
And it was not happy.
Yeah.
And there was very little joy.
Yeah.
Everyone in my family was traumatized. My parents were living with us. I was still really sick. And so I couldn't take care of my own baby. I actually wasn't allowed to lift him because when you have abdominal surgery, you can't lift more than 10 pounds, and most people's babies are under 10 pounds.
Oh, my goodness.
So I wasn't allowed to pick up my baby for 6 weeks.
Oh.
So I had to wait until, so that was terrible. I mean, the people would like place him on me, but that was also something too, like, it's not the same. And also, like, he was so big that it was really hard to like be like with him because he was like he would take up my whole torso, so where all of my incisions and things were, he'd be kicking. Like, it was just not comfortable. And so I spent a lot of time on the couch watching other people take care of my baby and wishing that my life was different, and having an immense amount of shame and guilt over feeling that way.
Kayleigh, I did not realize all of the intricate details of your story, and I'm just in awe of you. And thank you so much for, I know we get really good when like it's a part of our like organization to like tell our story in a minute, but then like it really does still take a lot to really dig deep and be like, these are the parts of my story that happened, and I've done the work to be able to tell them, but it doesn't mean that it's still not hard to relive and talk about those things. And so I'm just, thank you for sharing with our community, and and for really just being vulnerable, because like, you know, like we talked about, it's a different kind of grief to relive your birth story, not from your own memory, but from the memory and photos that other people have taken for you. And you can be so grateful to have those. And I still will be like, right, can you tell me what the doctor said again? And like, at what time did they go back? And at what time did this happen? And I'm so grateful that he can relive these things with me. But there's a grief that comes with that of, I don't remember any of these things, you know?
Yeah. There's a lot of grief in the lack of memory. I think for me, the hardest part to accept was, and there's something at this point, almost 5 years out, that is remarkable and like somewhat beautiful about this to me, but also is the hardest part of my story to integrate, which was not being alive when my child was born.
Wow.
And not like, he didn't have anyone in that room, which I know is, for anyone who's under general anesthesia, usually there is no partner in the room until like your baby is born into a room full of people that it doesn't know and that it's not familiar with. And for me, you know, he didn't even have like my heartbeat to remind him of where he lived for 9 months. And so that part of my story has definitely been one of the most difficult parts to integrate.
On that note, then, you know, you're a provider yourself, but you're also a mom who's done the hard work of inner healing yourself. And so, you know, for you, what were some of your first steps to healing? And, you know, again, reiterating that healing is a lifelong journey. We're not going to pretend that all of a sudden one
we
day.
are still healing.
And so, you know, what was kind of your first step towards, you know what, I'm gonna start to really, you know, accept this part of my story and really begin to heal? You know, what did that look like for you?
I would say it was a little different for me being a therapist, because even though in the moments in the ICU, I spent 2 weeks in the ICU, I was like, I'm just so grateful. Like, we're going to get to go home and be this family of 3 and all of that. I also was like, am I allowed to curse on this podcast?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Because I was also like, this is really fucked up, and all of us are going to be fucked up. So you're getting therapy, I'm getting therapy, everyone's getting therapy. So yeah, it was like Oprah with the car. Everyone is getting therapy. And so I just got really lucky. The Postpartum Stress Center, which is run by Karen Kleiman, which is like a world-renowned perinatal mental health center, is right outside of Philadelphia. So it was about 45 minutes away from where I was. And this was in 2019, so before virtual really took off. And I had the support, the family support, to be able to drive 45 minutes to and from for appointments at postpartum stress. And I was in my first appointment a week after I was discharged from the hospital. And it's interesting. I don't remember this, but my therapist, like 3 years, like once I like graduated from her, like 3 years after, I said something about like, I don't know what I said about something with therapy. And she was like, well, you know how hard you advocated, right? And I was like, no. She's like, yeah. When you called, I was like, okay. And so we have an appointment in like 2 or 3 weeks for an intake. Can you wait? And you literally were like, nope. And I was like, okay, I'll see you next week.
Yeah.
And I was like, great.
Wow.
I don't remember that, but so I knew in my like therapist heart how destroyed I was going to be from this experience and how much support I needed to get through the like initial event. And I ended up going on an SSRI, which was incredibly helpful. I was experiencing a lot of postpartum depression and a lot of health anxiety. And that was life-saving for me for a certain amount of time to really just get me through. So therapy and medication for me were really important steps right after my experience. And it took a lot. Like therapy in the beginning was like acute. It was like what I call like psychological first aid. Like we are just getting week to week here. And then slowly it started to be more of that like trauma integration work and figuring out how this becomes a part of my story. But like, I didn't get my head above water until after a year, I would say. Yeah. And I had another surgery right the same week I actually had Cal. Because of COVID, everything, it got backed up to like the same exact week that I had Cal a year later. I had to have a major abdominal surgery. So that definitely pushed me back because I was in like the same like state, like physical state as I was the year before, where I had like this big incision in my stomach, and it was just, that definitely set me back. But I would say around like 18 months, I started to feel like I got my head above water. And then like the grief. And for me, the grief is very much tied to of course, just all of the loss that I had in this experience, and also that I will never get another shot at it. I will never get another chance to have an experience where I'm alive during the birth of my child. And so that grief will never leave me. I will sit with that for the rest of my life, but it has changed. I have another metaphor for you.
Let's do it. We love metaphors.
I do too. So with grief specifically, and I did not make this metaphor up. I want to be very clear. I don't know where I got it. It was like through the grapevine, but it is not mine to keep as my own. But so I'm sharing it with the world. Basically, if we view grief as a room in your house, right? When your event first happens, when your experience with grief first happens, that's the only room in your house. You've got nowhere else to go. It's overwhelming. It's all consuming. You're just like sitting on the floor of that room crying. And then slowly, this is where that time piece comes in. With time, we have these other experiences and we build these other rooms in our house. And the more time that passes, the more rooms we're building. The grief room never goes away. It's always there. And sometimes we even like go back and sit in it because we want to. Like we want to remember that experience. We want to feel that grief. Other times we're like shoved back into it. We don't want to be. But we have so many more places to go. Like I have so many more places to go 5 years out in my house than that grief room. And his birthday, I'm going to be popping back in to that room in a few months. But that capacity that my house has grown to allows me to have other experiences outside of the trauma and the grief of this birth experience. So like I just posted for Mother's Day, like, we will always grieve these first moments that we lost out on. And there are all of these other moments that we get to have. One does not negate the other, because I often will hear, how can you be upset about one singular moment when you get a lifetime of them? And I'm like, because
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
I am, and I'm going to be for the rest of my life. And I'm also going to recognize all of these other beautiful, wonderful moments that I get.
Yeah.
Snuggling with my son on my chest that I didn't get when he was born.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think an important thing too is, again, it just comes down to this time piece, right? Like you're 5 years out from your story. I'm 5 years out.
Almost, yeah.
Aisha, you're about 5 years out too, right? We're all
4,
about that
yeah.
5-year mark with Enzo. And it's just, I think it's to the new moms that are just like fresh from birth or within that first year period. I hope you hear from these 5-year oldies, just that we are still navigating parts of our story, and that it's okay if you're not to the level that you would hope to be yet. Like healing is a lifelong journey, and that can be painful to accept because we want that checklist so badly of like, oh my gosh, okay, I'll do the steps and I'll be healed and I'll never enter that grief room again. I don't want to go there. I don't want to look at it. But it's like you said, with time, we get to experience that joy and that hope, and that, there is goodness ahead. We just released a merchandise collection of that message of there is goodness ahead. It doesn't negate the experiences that we've had. It doesn't remove the grief that we'll experience, but there is goodness ahead. And so I hope you hear from our 5-year-old post-NICU, post-traumatic birth selves that there is goodness ahead, and that healing is lifelong. And so, Kayleigh, I would love to know, what hope would you leave for moms in our community as we kind of close out this episode, and what message of hope would you offer them?
I think that I would offer the hope that we hear a lot that you will never be the same person that you were before your trauma. You will never be the same person you were before your trauma. And that can feel really scary. And this version of me is pretty freaking cool. And it took me a really long time to realize that. I grieved a lot, and you deserve to grieve for your past self. And I think I never realized how amazing and cool these versions of us get to be too. With all of our stuff and all of our trauma. Like, I think that the hope that this version of you will find its way and is just as incredible, if not more so, than that past version of you. It's not, we lost that version and all there is grief. There is hope for that version of you too.
Well, that's
so
beautiful.
Good. I love
Thank
that.
you so much for sharing, and just being that voice that kind of is reminding all the listeners that they're worth the work to heal. They're worth the time, and that things will get better. And your story is such an amazing story. And if anyone hasn't yet, go follow Birth Trauma Mama on Instagram, because there is so much more wisdom in that page. Like what we heard today.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you. Thank you both for having me. This is amazing. I love, love, love the work that you do. I'm always so jealous of your merchandise because it's beautiful and I'm obsessed with it.
You're so sweet.
So shout out to you guys and your merchandise, and your whole branding is just adorable, and I love it so much. And there's so much hope in it. Like, I love the hope in it. I think that's the important part, right? Outside of it being cute, adorable.
Right. No, I hear you. Well, mamas, we will definitely link in the show notes ways to continue to connect with Kayleigh and how to follow her work and find her community as well. But Kayleigh, once again, thank you so much for not only the work that you do, but sharing your story so bravely. And it's just evident that every time you share, another mom feels less alone, and that is life-changing work. And so thank you for being here with us today. Thank you for being a part of this community. And we just appreciate you and are so grateful that we can connect you to our moms. So mamas, have a wonderful rest of your week. And we hope this episode just reminds you that your birth story is remarkable, just like you are. So we love you. We'll be back next week. Thank you so much for listening to the Dear NICU Mama podcast. If you loved this episode, we'd be so grateful for a review.
For more ways to connect with the Dear NICU Mama Sisterhood, check out the links in the episode description.